can people find love after they've had a loss? That's the topic we're going to be addressing today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. Today I have a new guest on Flourish-Meant. His name is James C. Magruder. He is the multi-published author of essays, articles, and inspirational Christian fiction, including the novels The Glimpse and his recent novel, The Desert Between Us. And that is a story of love after loss and victory over grief. And that's the topic we're going to be addressing today. So I'm glad that you're here on the show today, Jim. Welcome to Flourish-Meant.
Thank you so much, Tina. I'm certainly happy to be here.
In the second half of our conversation with James C. Magruder, I want to get into some more specifics about how we can experience loss and sorrow and yet become resilient in our hearts at the same time. Jim, can you talk to the audience a little bit more? We talked about it a little bit in our first half of our conversation about how tears can be healing. Tears aren't just emotionally healthy, they're also good for us physically. They give us some detoxification. They are good for us to renew our minds and our spirits. So talk to us a little bit about what you found biblically and clinically about grief and tears.
Clinically, you're right about tears and detoxing and those kind of things. I didn't find a tremendous amount of research on that other than the psychological aspects of venting and relief. In the book, I refer to it as a relief valve. And by shedding tears, you release a tremendous amount of stress. And it gives you an opportunity to interpret how you're feeling. Biblically, again, that's a good question about what does it say in the Bible about grieving. All I know is that the way the Bible has helped me and others in grieving is in what it says about God's care for us. I'm thinking of James 4:18, draw near unto God and he will draw near unto you. That to me is the greatest source of comfort that I can think of in terms of dealing with grief. When I lose something or when I lost my mom, although I didn't understand the gospel, I did understand God and I did understand feeling close to him. And so I thought that brought a certain amount of peace and comfort. Also in Psalm 34:18, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. That is a biblical verse that I've drawn upon to help me deal with grief in my life. I want to know that the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and he saves those who are crushed in spirit, because that's what grief is. It's being crushed in spirit.
So true. And we want to look at grief as something that we can push down, we can push aside, we can overcome really quickly. Yet it's a process that you don't go around, you have to go through. In Psalm 23, for example, it says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, which is definitely where we are when we're in grief. We don't walk around it, we don't skip over it, we don't tunnel under it, but we have to go through it. Can you talk about how that brings us sometimes closer to the experience of God's goodness?
In the story, I talk about what the main character learned in the desert. And I don't want to give away too much of the metaphor, but you can understand what the desert between us is. There are so many things that God will reveal to us when we're in the desert. And that those are those dry, lonely places where we feel abandoned, but he's there. And I think all of us can admit or understand that when we have been through the driest, emptiest, hardest times of our life, those are the times where God shows himself more clearly and speaks to the heart more dearly. And in this character, that's what he's going to find. He's going to find through his grandfather and his father and through the Bible how God speaks to him in this desert of grief. I think there's nothing more important than in Scripture and understanding God's role in our life when we go through the darkest times. Even though Isaiah tells us that my ways are not your ways and my thoughts are not your thoughts, we never understand why we've lost somebody. But that's when we just have to trust Him um, for whatever that reason that is. And that isn't a satisfying answer, but I think it's just true that we have to trust Him in those darkest nights.
Yes, we want to ask why when we're in the desert. Yet, why, when you're in a desert, why doesn't help you get through the desert? It just gets you more stranded and more lost and more stuck. Yet, a desert is also not some place that any of us intentionally strand ourselves. But when we find ourselves in the desert, there is something very powerful that we can learn and discover in that space. So I love that you're bringing that up today, that discussion of being in the desert with God, which is very biblical. We experience that when we're in grief, which again is someplace we would never choose to be. Yet God can be with us there, even when we're asking all the wrong questions, just like the question why.
That's absolutely right.
So, when we're thinking about those two dramatic questions that your novel is answering, the first one we've talked about a little bit, can someone love after they've experienced loss? You talked about how you've interviewed people and you included in your novel that message of hope that people can experience hope after that loss. But the second question is something that's more interesting and that might be really fresh in someone's heart that's listening today. Can they love the same after they've experienced a loss? Can you talk about how you went on a journey of discovery to answer that question as well?
Right. That is the journey of Chase Kincaid, the main character. And that's how you're going to see him evolve. I think there's a really pivotal scene in this story that I really loved. And it sort of answers that question. It's a scene in the treehouse. There's a treehouse on the cover of the book, as you know, and a lot of people are wondering, what does a treehouse have to do with the desert between us? Well, I'm not going to tell anybody that. You have to read the story. But in that treehouse, there's a conversation that goes on. The first night that the 8-year-old boy and his father is Chase Kincaid, 37, his son is Clay, he's 8 years old. They have a conversation in the treehouse when they're sleeping. They're going to sleep overnight in it. So it creates an atmosphere of communication. And Chase, of course, is still struggling with the question, can I ever love as deeply again? And they have a conversation about two dogs they owned. One was Clay's dog, and the other was his mother's dog, who his mother passed away, of course. And his mother's dog was very sickly, but his dog was fine. And Chase asked his son, well, which dog did you like best? And his 8-year-old son says, I think I love them both. And he said, well, did you love one more than the other? Because one was your dog and the other one was sickly, and it was mom's. He said, no, I think, Dad, I love them differently, but the same amount. And this sends Chase on his journey through the rest of the book, thinking that out of the mouths of babes just came his answer that you can love differently, but the same amount. And I think that's what the reader is going to conclude. For the person that you're talking about, Tina, who has a fresh loss, you can love differently, but the same amount. And that's what I'm finding in older couples who in their 70s and 80s that have lost a spouse and they've married again. Many have said it's as good as before. Some say might even be better, but most say it's different, but it's still wonderful.
That's such a powerful message. I know that we've answered some questions about permissions of it, that are in your book, those permissions to grieve, first of all, and the permission to love after grief. You first have to have the permission to grieve, then you can have permission to love. And then thirdly, I think you're talking about the permission to love the same amount. That permission is necessary because people often get stuck in the fear that they're trying to replace someone. Can you talk a little bit about how you looked into this in your research, both primary and secondary research that you did for this novel, when people were afraid of feeling like they were replacing the person that they lost?
What I talked to people about was what I call the comparison trap, where they are calling each other by the name of the deceased spouse. They are saying, I used to do this all the time. Now you don't like it when I golf, or whatever the case may be. You have to understand that it's a fresh relationship and it's not the same person. So you're going to have differences. And in many cases, what it involved too was mixed families with children. So it got complicated. But what they told me they did is they tried not to look at it as a comparison, that it's a new relationship. And one person in particular, the guy that his wife died of a heart transplant, complications of the heart transplant, he was looking at how much he had changed from the first wife to the second wife, and how much he had matured, and how much his love had matured, and how much his behavior had changed. He wasn't a good young husband, he said. He was a much better older husband. And that gave him the maturity to say, she is going to be different than my first wife as well. So it led to, he called it a more mature love that was actually easier than his young, impulsive days. That's one thing I discovered by interviewing people who've been through this.
So can you share with the audience one final thing that you really want them to hear about loving people after you've gone through grief?
To realize that it's a new relationship. It's unfair to compare it. Don't feel guilt about loving again in the sense that you're feeling you're betraying the one you've lost. Realize, and the book will bring this out too, that the deceased wants you to have a life again. They want you to love again. You have their permission to love again. Why not give yourself permission to love again and believe that you can?
Such a powerful message. I so appreciate you being on the show today, Jim. Can you share with the audience how they can stay in touch with you and get a copy of The Desert Between Us?
Yes, you can stay in touch with me via email, jamescmagruder@gmail.com. My website is jamescmagruder.com. Facebook, jim.magruder.35. But if you write to me or go to my website and contact me, there's a form there to contact me. Please stay in touch. You can buy the Desert Between Us right now on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, ChristianBooks.com, and Goodreads.com.
I hope that all of you listening were inspired and encouraged by this message of how you can love after loss. And of course, I also hope that you will hit subscribe and come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant.